Good writing is not about what you put in, but what you take out. Hey, I'm Father Roderick. It is day 38 of my journey towards writing my own first fantasy novel, and I love this book. This is written by John D. Radcliffe, and there are actually two tomes of this, and the author describes the whole genesis of Tolkien's The Hobbit. There's also a very thick tome, which is like a reader's companion for The Lord of the Rings, where the author does something similar. It's just like annotating the books. And what always has struck me when reading through this book is how much the original story that Tolkien told his kids has changed over the years. Tolkien didn't really set his stories in stone. He continued to refine them, rewrite them, and in hindsight, after having written The Lord of the Rings, he went back to add and change so much in The Hobbit to make it fit with the world that he had developed later on in The Lord of the Rings. And this is partially also why there is such a huge legacy that Christopher Tolkien, his son, has worked on for the remainder of his life, trying to compile and organize all these different versions of stories and also discarded stories and half-written things. There is just so much that didn't end up in The Lord of the Rings or in The Hobbit that helps us understand how Tolkien wrote, what his writing process was. And I think that you see in books like this that indeed for Tolkien, it's true that the success, the quality of what he wrote is just as much about what he wrote, but also as much as of what he left out and what he discarded. I was thinking of this when I was writing today. So this is day 3 that I'm. Is it day 3? Yeah, it's actually the third day that I'm working on the draft, even though it's already the 7th of February. But I started with some days where I barely got anything done. And so today I wrote another 4,301 words. Now that is above and beyond the goal that I set for myself today. However, I also deleted an additional 1,696 words. So the total amount of words that I wrote, that I added to my story today is roughly 3,000. So my total word count of this first draft, chapters 0, 1, 2, and 3, is now 9,064 words, which means I'm perfectly on schedule. If I keep on cranking out 3,000 words each day, I will have a novel of about 70,000 words at the end of this month. I'm very happy about that. I'm not so happy about those, 1,696 words that I had to scrap. Why? Because many of you and also many experienced writers keep telling me, don't ever look back. This is your first draft. The idea is to just write as if there's no tomorrow. And whenever you think of something that you should have changed or an additional idea, just add a note, but don't go back, don't rewrite. And that's exactly what I did. I actually did go back, even to the prologue. I took some stuff out because in the meantime, my ideas have changed a little bit. And I felt that there was an element in that prologue that is in direct conflict with what I was developing now. And the same is true also when it comes to the relationship between Orla and her sister Neve. These two characters have continued to grow. Actually, I think they've always been the way they are right now, but I'm starting to get to know them better. I'm starting to get a better feel of their relationship as sisters. And also, I think what I notice is that now that I'm writing and I'm kind of, how do you say that? I'm choosing a path for them. When I was still like um, conceptualizing, outlining, brainstorming, um, I had many different ideas, and I had a general sense of what I wanted each character to be, but I'm starting to feel that the way I'm writing, especially Orla now, is much less black and white as the way I pictured her in the month of January. She has um, also a much more gentle side to her. So I pictured her as someone who's always angry and always. There is definitely that. She is a very determined woman. She knows what she wants and she knows what she hates, and she's very clear about that. But especially in the relationship with her sister, there's this banter that is I'm trying to imagine the banter because I only have one sister, so I don't have two. So I cannot really use my own life experience for writing that relationship. However, of course, as many of you, I've read countless books, I've watched so many TV series and movies, and I just have a lot of a lot of friends that I observe and learn from, and so I think I managed to write a pretty nuanced relationship between the two. And if the two sisters are together and they're no man and there's nothing that kind of triggers Orla, you see a much softer side to her, and she's got a good sense of humor. That's also something that I did not expect to happen, and so has Neve. You can tell that these two sisters. Um, have learned how to use humor to defend themselves also, almost as a weapon. So sometimes I'm just chuckling when I see how they talk to each other. It's so funny. I did not expect that to happen, but it also meant that I had to go back, or I wanted to go back. I didn't have to, but I wanted to go back and fix some of that dialogue in the first chapter, or in the second chapter actually. The second chapter. That's when I introduce Orla. Um, and then there was another thing that I completely changed. And you heard me talk about this tower in the center of the enclosure of the monastery. And my idea was the tower is a magical tower, and if you step inside, it on the inside is like a TARDIS. It's super big. But then when I was writing it felt wrong because you have to imagine if you go to Glendalough, where that tower that I envisioned is still standing. It's this very small, relatively small tower. It's probably a little larger than this office, but not much. So there's only room for some ladders inside or a very narrow stone staircase. I'm not exactly sure. Depends maybe on the tower. And then there are some wooden floors. There's not much room there. So to me, even though of course I can explain it away by its magical tower, in this first part of the book, you don't know that yet. That is something you'll discover much later. And so uh, and then the door, the entrance is above ground. It's like 3 monks high or tall. I'm deliberately not using the metric system or feet or yards or whatever in the book because I'm aiming for an international audience, and I just don't want to get involved in having to, pick and choose between different types of metric systems. After all, this is the Middle Ages. I don't know how they measured, but so I'm measuring in monks. So the door is 3 monks above ground, and that I thought that was actually just for safety reasons, so that, for instance, if they had to climb into the tower because of an attack, they could just throw away or lift up even the ladder and be safe. But in fact, it's actually the reason that the door is so high is because of stability reasons. If they would put the door at the base of the tower usually, those towers didn't have any foundation. It was built on a rocky ground, so it wasn't going to tilt over like the Tower of Pisa would do later. But if they would, and I guess they just figured that out by trying. If they would put the door at ground level, usually those towers would be very unstable and collapse. But then I had to just kind of visualize how these monks would go up that ladder and enter through the door and then disappear. And then what happens to the ladder? And does that make sense? Yeah, they will lift up. So I just kind of written the whole scene where the last monk just like takes the ladder and pulls it inward. And I was like, oh, what is he going to do with that ladder? And why is the ladder only lifted up when they are in the tower, when, that tower should be protected day and night? So it didn't make sense. I couldn't explain it away. And so I did a little bit of research about the scriptoria. The scriptorium is this building where the monks would write. And you may remember this from the Name of the Rose, if you've ever seen that movie. By the way, if you haven't, recommend it. It's based on a book, and it's pretty good. Sean Connery plays a detective monk. It's a lot of fun. But that takes place somewhat later. I think in the 9th century, maybe even 10th century. I'm not sure. But they show a scriptorium, and it's a Hollywood version. It's not at all. There is no historical evidence that scriptoria looked like that. What we do know, we have one floor plan, but it's from a monastery, I think in Austria, and that appears to be kind of an exception. And it turns out that some of these holy books were written by just one monk, and he would sit on an island in a small chapel, just dedicating his entire life to creating this book. Not the Book of Kells, because that was created much later when the monasteries were bigger. But in my era, the time where my story takes place, there would probably, just be one or a few monks working on that. And so at one point earlier this morning, I was like, oh, maybe the scriptorium should be a small chapel on an island. And I started to write, and they went to the island. But then I was like, no, that doesn't work. Is the island, but then I have to situate the monastery near the sea. I didn't set that up. Plus, in the prologue, there's already a coastline in that story spell, so that's going to confuse people. They think it's the same location. And I'm like, this does not work. What am I going to do? And I decided to just be very pragmatic. I am going to build a scriptorium adjacent to the church, to the chapel. And it's going to be a special, so I'm still divided whether it should be circular or a square or rectangular. The thing is, if once we go inside later on, we will see that it's actually on the inside. It is much bigger than on the outside, but not in horizontal, in horizontally, but vertically. So once you're inside, there are stairs that go up and round, and you see all these angels coming from above, descending and helping these monks to write. So that is basically just a different version of what I came up with for the tower. And it feels better somehow. It makes more sense. I also think it's kind of closer to, probably what would have been the situation in the 6th century. The problem is a lot of those buildings were built out of wood, and there is not much left. We don't have much archaeological data that helps us to determine what a scriptorium looked like. However, that gives me a lot of kind of freedom to just make something up myself. But I try to stay true to kind of how these settlements looked like in the 6th century. So then, once I had that figured out, I rewrote that entire sequence where the scribes go into the tower, and now they go into the scriptorium. And then I had another problem. While I was rewriting that, I realized that those scribes are a bit of an anonymous group. They're just monks in blue robes. Why would we care? Why? It doesn't make sense. Why would Ty have such a strong desire to be part of that group if we don't know anyone of that group? If it's just an anonymous bunch of you could say, like almost these characters that you see in video games that are just standing along the road, and they repeat the same phrases over and over again, NPCs, non-playing characters. So, and then I remembered that I had introduced a monk in the dormitory in the first chapter of the book. It's a monk who they all sleep in a. They didn't have individual cells, at least not in the monastery that I'm creating. They would just sleep together in a larger hall. And so when Tai wakes up, the first monk that looks him in the eye is this like chubby, kind, beardy, Hagrid type of monk. And he's just super kind. And I was thinking, well, maybe I can, turn him into a cook and it's a friend. And I don't know. Didn't have any specific ideas. And all of a sudden it struck me, hey, that could actually be a monk who is a scribe. Because it's Ty's friend. And he's kind, and that is why he's rooting for Ty to pass the test, because, he likes Ty, and he hopes that Ty will join him and the other brothers. And then all of a sudden, that anonymous group becomes a group of people like, I forgot his name, but anyway, like that big guy. And then I was like, okay, so he could actually become the mentor, and he's so kind. Obviously, yes, he's going to agree to train Orla in secret. He's just that kind of guy. And so I moved some stuff around, and all of a sudden, he is a scribe. And it also gave me an idea for later on, of course, when our group finally has to leave the monastery. He's not gonna survive, and that is going to be a dramatic moment in Ty's life, because that was his friend, that was his mentor, and now he has to go all alone. I'm setting up some pretty sad events later on in the book. Then I started to write a little bit more, and that idea of that island kept coming back. And I was thinking, so where, if Ty was hurt in that attack by the dragon, etc., and so he's in the hospital, he won't be able to participate in the test. Well, that's kind of boring. And he's going to miss out, and so are we as readers. No, I want him to take part in the test. How is that going to happen? And then I was like, oh, you know what? Felix is going to heal him using forbidden magic. We don't know that yet, but Felix is extremely charismatic. Oh my goodness, he's a George Clooney type of guy. I'm surprised, because that was not at all how I envisioned him. But so he's kind of a young George Clooney, is super charismatic, and he is helping our heroes, which makes him immediately likable. We like this guy, and we don't know yet that he's the same guy of the prologue who did these horrific things. But that's all part of his plan. And so he heals Ty, and he says, you got to participate in this test. And then it all clicked into place. I was like, what if that test is not taking place in the enclosure of the monastery? Because that's kind of a boring place. I mean, the church is interesting, the scriptorium is interesting, but the rest it's really small. It's not like these big 12th century monasteries that we know from many movies. So I was like, well, I've got an idea. What if the test is going to take place on one of those holy islands? And I've visited some of them. Like, I went to Church Island, which is not in Ireland, but in Scotland. And is it in Scotland or just southern part of Scotland? Anyway, is it Wales? I don't know. Anyway, but so there's Holy Island. You can only go there when the tide is low, and then that is where Cuthbert, I think, the monk Cuthbert lived, and had a big monastery. And Cuthbert himself would often retreat on a tiny island in the sea, where he would just swim in the bloody cold water. Anyway, so I was like, okay, I think I'm going to do something like that. So what if there is this island in a lake, and they have to travel through the woods in order to get to that lake. And that is a sacred place, and it's still magical, because this monk, this saint who lived there, he is the one who created the first pages of the Codex Fabulae, this magical book that the monks protect and still continue to add pages to. So it all started there, and the test to become a scribe happens on that island, and it's gonna be a magical test. So all this is going to take place in secret. Nobody else can see this. They have to go to that island, and then on the island there are three tests or subtests that they have to pass. One is they have to find their spirit animal. That's how I call them. It's basically these creatures that will protect them if they are in a story spell. And in the story spell, they become these mythological monsters, right? Or creatures, defenders. So that's a test with animals. That could be fun. That's where Ty is going to find his squirrel. The squirrel is going to be threatened by the evil twins, and they're going to try to kill the squirrel. The squirrel gets hurt, and Ty takes care of the squirrel and heals the squirrel with his natural magic, which is forbidden. But I like that. He's got a bond with a squirrel, and we see some magic in that relationship. I love it. So anyway, and the second test is a test of is a musical test. This is something that I came up with in the prologue. Music can enhance the spell, and so if you want to become a story mage, you need to know how to play an instrument, which almost none of these novices actually know. And so there apparently is this somewhere in this small cloister that is on the island that is still there where the saint has lived. There is a hidden instrument. It's a sacred instrument. It's kind of a bit mysterious. There's a legend that the monk kind of saw this instrument in his dreams or in a vision and then created it. And there is no instrument like it in Ireland. You probably guess what that instrument is, right? It's a harp. And that is historically completely inaccurate because harps were invented centuries later. But not in my story, because this monk had a vision of the future. He saw how important the harp would become for Ireland, and so he decided to make one. It is the precursor. It's the mother of all harps, and he has hidden it somewhere in the monastery. The monks have to find it, and then they have to play notes on it, a certain melody, and they have to figure out what that melody is. How do we know? And the melody, once they discover what that is, I still have to write all this, by the way. I just took some notes here. So I wrote so much more than what is counted by my program. But anyway, so they figure out what the melody is, and that opens a secret entrance to an underground cave. So they descend. Under the island is a cave. And in that cave is going to be the last test. And that is a proper storytelling test. Each of the participants will have to write a story spell, because you always need written words in order to create a story spell. Even the experienced story mages, they may know it by heart, but they always carry with them an animal skin on which there is the original story, the spell. And those spells are written by the story mages themselves. So here, these candidates have to show their skill in creating a story spell. And they can do one of two things. They can either copy an inscription on the walls of the cave, and it's an original spell written by that or left behind by that sacred monk, or they can come up with something themselves. And of course, Ty makes the wrong choice. He's like, yeah, I'm not creative. I can't do this. I will just copy what the monk wrote. And then once they all have created their spells, they each have to execute it and step into their own story spell. And then that's where Ty gets into trouble. I don't know what happens, but I forgot to say, Orla and Felix are also joining Ty in these quests. So they kind of, especially Orla, gets smuggled onto the island, and Orla saves him. Or something happens, it's very dramatic, he almost dies, and Orla saves the day, and then she gets discovered. Oh, there's a girl! She gets punished, and that makes her so incredibly angry and resentful because she saved these monks, and now she's being punished just because she broke the rules. Anyway, I didn't write anything of that in my document, but I did. So I'm now they're walking towards the lake. That's where I stopped, and there's some banter between the two sisters, and it's a lot of fun. But yeah, you can probably tell that I had to rewrite a lot of stuff and get a lot of things out. but I do not regret it. I think, especially at this stage, I'm still kind of figuring out the story. I'm figuring out my characters. So I really feel that this is kind of discovery writing and planning at the same time. And there are always these moments where, okay, now I see what I need to write, and then the writing actually is super simple. But I've been pacing back and forth in the living room multiple times during writing, just because, like, it doesn't make sense, it doesn't feel right, and then all of a sudden, lightning strikes, and I sit down here and I type as a madman, and in the end, I still wrote 3,000 words, and it took me about 6 hours. So yeah, not too shabby, exactly on schedule. So despite me having revised more than I actually would have liked, I think the end result is what counts. And I think I love what I've written so far. Hopefully people will love it once I get to revision 500. Thanks for watching. Appreciate your feedback. Appreciate you following me. And I will see you tomorrow. Take care.